Andrew Loog Oldham is an important force in the success of the early Stones. In fact, he plays a big role in shaping the image and, to a certain extent, the attitude of Rolling Stones music. And sometimes he isn't given as much credit for shaping the early, even the sound and the image of the group as I think he deserves. Andrew Loog Oldham had worked public relations PR for Brian Epstein in London, including the well, he mostly promoted the Beatles in early 1963. See, Brian Epstein was still based in Liverpool, and I think he felt like he was not getting the right kind of promotional support from EMI, Parlophone in London. So he thought, well, I'll hire my own guy to help promote the Beatles' music in London. And so that guy was Andrew Loog Oldham. So he got a chance to see Brian Epstein at a little bit maybe closer vantage point than a lot of other people who were involved with the Beatles, and got to help sort of craft a kind of a public image for the Beatles. I mean, he also met Phil Spector, and that's of course where he got the advice about leasing the tapes to the record company and not signing directly with them, keeping control of the masters. So Phil Spector was kind of a mentor to Andrew Loog Oldham. And as I said before, he was such a young guy when all of this was going on. Had to bring in Eric Easton because he was too young to get a license to be an agent. That's a relationship that was not rocky from the start, but it wasn't too long before there was real conflict between those two guys. He had no experience, Andrew, in the recording studio. And so this has led a lot of people to question, well, what exactly was his contribution to those records? He's listed as producer, but he didn't really understand the recording studio. There's a story, who knows how true some of these stories are, but the story is that when they did their first session, you know, they were booked for, I don't know, a 2-hour slot or a 3-hour slot, something like that. They finished recording the song about 5 minutes before their time was up. And he said, well, that's great. We finished with 5 minutes to spare. And the recording engineer said, well, what about mixdown? They didn't really know that after you recorded the song, there were some post-production things that had to be done that also counted on the clock of what he was paying for. And so that's usually used as an indication of showing how little Andrew knew about the machinations and the technical end of recording. But that's not quite fair. What he did know is the kind of spirit and the image that the music should project. And he played an awfully big role in shaping that. So as a producer, he was a kind of a big picture guy. He was a guy who had a sense for how to really present the Rolling Stones both on record and in live concerts. And this was a very, very big part of why their music was so successful. But he was probably not a traditional producer the way we think about record producers, other record producers, say, like George Martin. Andrew Loog Oldham was a real student of what we might call pop hype. When you think about the world of British popular music in the late 50s and the early 1960s, especially teen pop, there's one figure that really sort of looms above all the rest of them, and that is a manager by the name of Larry Parnes. Larry Parnes was really thought of oftentimes as the sort of Svengali of the British pop singing idol kind of guy. He had what he called a stable of artists, a stable of pop stars, all with these really sort of dynamic names. There was Tommy Steele and Marty Wilde and Billy Fury, and the singer that the Beatles ended up backing for a short tour, I think of Scotland, a guy by the name of Johnny Gentle. Paul McCartney always says, everybody else got Steele, Wilde, Fury, we got Gentle. But nevertheless, those names, of course everybody was renamed, those names really kind of were part of the hype around these singers. And this is one of the things that Andrew Loog Oldham really latched onto and really admired. If you read his most recent book, Stone Alone, or Stone Free, you can sort of see how much respect there's a chapter devoted to Larry Parnes and his influence. He also, in his own writing, Andrew Loog Oldham, in Stoned and Two Stoned, he refers again and again to the fictional character Johnny Jackson. Johnny Jackson is a kind of old school pop star manager in the late 1950s, and he's a character in a musical called Espresso Bongo, which then becomes the movie in 1959, starring then very current sort of teen heartthrob Cliff Richard, kind of Elvis, or England's answer to Elvis was Cliff Richard, a very big star, a whole series of big hits from the late 50s through the early 1960s. You couldn't get any bigger than Cliff Richard. And here he was in this movie playing a character called Bongo Herbert. And the story is all about this hardened, agent who's working at promoting Bongo Herbert, hyping him. And then it turns out that, well, I don't want to ruin the story for you, but it has a kind of an unhappy ending for Johnny Jackson. This Johnny Jackson ends up losing his Bongo Herbert to another manager. That's as much of the story as I'll tell you. But he's constantly, Andrew Loog Oldham is sort of quoting in this sort of very sort of as if he's inspired by the words of Johnny Jackson. Again, a kind of a manager, right? So he starts out managing the Rolling Stones, very much sort of in the mold of Larry Parnes or the fictional character Johnny Jackson or Brian Epstein. In other words, he thinks about the Rolling Stones in a very traditional kind of way. So when you see the Stones in those first couple of singles and the imaging that goes with it, they really do look like something much closer to the Beatles than they will end up being. In fact, he sort of gets the idea at one point that maybe he's going at this the wrong way, trying to make the Stones so much like the Beatles. What he really needs to do is to create a kind of anti-Beatles, right? So if the Beatles are the good guys, the polite, charming ones, he will cast the Stones as the rather rude, not so charming, rebellious ones, the bad boys. You've got the good boys and the bad boys. Or as Keith Richards likes to say, the Beatles wore the white hats, and so we wore the black hats, right? So the good guys and the bad guys. And so he starts to, in the early days of the Stones, as he's sort of working the hype for the group to try to get them hits in the UK, starts trying to get all kinds of stories planted about, their bad boy nature. Now, Mick Jagger has said, we probably weren't as bad as Andrew portrayed us, but we were certainly willing to play the role. I mean, the role is probably more convincing when the people who play it are willing to play it and have some aptitude for it, and we certainly were willing to play it. It seems like we really had some aptitude, but much of it was constructed initially. He had stories planted in the English media like, would you let your daughter go with a Rolling Stone, which was then picked up as, would you let your daughter marry a Rolling Stone? And it was all about the basic unsuitability of the Stones, and that all worked into the bad boy image that he crafted around the group. Interestingly, on the back of every album, there were, at least the first several albums, there were Andrew Loog Oldham liner notes. And the liner notes are kind of his little kind of poetic hype pieces about the group. And they're kind of interesting to read as you go through to sort of read how it is Andrew is sort of portraying the group on them. I mean, think about back in the days when you would go into a record store and you would, the albums, an album, 12-inch album's a pretty big sleeve. You're kind of going through the bins there. There's a real opportunity to advertise. Even if somebody doesn't buy your record, if they turn it over and read what you have to say about your group, well, at least you're spreading the word about the group, even if they don't buy the record. So he takes the opportunity of those liner notes to really continue crafting the image of the Rolling Stones, and they're an important part of the entire campaign. One of maybe the key elements in Andrew Loog Oldham's contribution, at least the one that he's mostly cited for, is it's Andrew Loog Oldham that convinces the Rolling Stones they need to write their own material. As we'll talk about in the next video, the first Rolling Stones hits and a lot of the album tracks were cover versions. Essentially, in many ways, the Rolling Stones were a great cover band for the first few albums, working their way toward becoming songwriters and doing their own original music. But for a while, the original music is really pretty much a small part of it. Well, initially, there isn't any original music. And as Andrew Loog Oldham has said, it was frustrating to put so much time into hyping a group and having them have a hit, only for somebody else to reap all the profits that came from the publishing end of it. In fact, before the Stones started doing, and ended up almost writing all of their own material, he would work out special publishing deals with the publishers on tunes that they would cover, and they would get a little bit of a cut of the publishing on that song if they would record it and promote it as a single. So there was some way of getting some of that, of what might be songwriter money out of people, all of the people who had written the songs. But the real important thing is that Andrew knew that publishing is where the money is, and he needed to be involved in publishing, and the Rolling Stones needed to be involved in publishing, and the songwriters were going to be Keith and Mick. Bill Wyman continued to write songs. They didn't record them very often. Brian Jones continued to try, but he never seemed to be able to finish anything that was ready to record. So it became Keith and Mick. And as Keith and Mick, we'll talk about this in the future, in a future video as well, as Keith and Mick are learning the songwriting craft, Andrew is feeding those songs to other artists that he begins to manage. You know, Larry Parnes had a whole stable of artists, and as the Beatles were coming up, Brian Epstein had a whole group of artists that he managed in addition to the Beatles. Well, Andrew Loog Oldham was thinking this way too, and so as Brian Epstein would have Lennon and McCartney write songs for other of his acts, so Andrew Oldham would have Mick and Keith write songs for his acts, and these songs were coming out on the charts a lot more than the Rolling Stones doing Mick and Keith songs initially. So we'll take a look at that next week, and we'll sort of see how that works. But maybe the most important of those early songs that are given to another artist is As Tears Go By, given to Marianne Faithfull, which becomes a pretty big hit for them in the UK. Andrew Loog Oldham behind all that. So we've had a chance to take a little bit closer look at Andrew Loog Oldham, the guy, we might say the man behind the scenes, except he kept putting himself out in front of the scenes, but you get what I mean. The guy who's sort of the sixth band member who helped craft the Rolling Stones image and sound. So let's move on now to talk about the first singles and the first EP.